Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our D Horizons Tribe interviews. I'm really excited today to have Judith Heumann, who's from America but is over in London at the moment doing some work with Leonard Cheshire Disability and working on various projects. So thank you for joining us today, Judy.
Thank you for asking me.
And so the last time, well, the only time we've actually met before was probably, I think it was about 5 years ago when Shrin and I...
2012 during the Paralympics.
2012, that's good. So it's almost 6 years ago now, wow. And so, yeah, Shrin and I came to meet you, and we'd been going like a year, I think, with the magazine. And it was just really amazing to meet such a role model who'd done so much in the disability movement and creating social change. I know we came away very buoyed up and energized to go on and do more. And yeah, the magazine's been growing, and we've been sort of getting a lot more traction and the word out there. So thank you for that inspiration all that time ago.
And congratulations to you.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think everyone watching is going to have come across you in one form or another, but it'd be great if you could just, give a few words a bit about your background, sort of where you grew up and about having polio, just to sort of set the scene a little bit.
So, I'm 70 years old, and so it becomes more difficult to be concise about 70 years. But I think, in a nutshell, I was born in 1947, and I think that my story is probably similar to other people in Great Britain, who became disabled right after the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And I had polio in 1949, and there were no laws in the United States like here that protected the rights of disabled people. And so I experienced the same thing that many others did in the States and here in other countries, namely that my mother took me to school and they wouldn't accept me in the local school. And we had something and have something in the States called home instruction, but it's typically used, if a child is sick and they need someone to be coming to the home. But at that point, what was going on in the 50s and 60s to a degree was the Board of Education would send a teacher to the house. So until I was 9 years old, I had a teacher who came to my house a total of 2.5 hours a week. So for the first grade, second grade, third grade, and half of the fourth grade, that's what I had.
Wow, not a lot of time at all.
No. I had two brothers. They were younger than me, and they were going to regular schools, but their school wasn't accessible. And although my mother would have taken me to and from school and helped me in and out, that wasn't agreeable. So then I started going to public school, not in my neighborhood, and I would ride each way an hour to an hour and a half for something that otherwise in a straight drive would have taken about 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Because we had to pick other kids up. And then when I went on to high school, the high school in my neighborhood was not accessible, so it was these long distances again. And then in high school, for my last 3 years of high school, my classes were all integrated, but for the first year, 3 of them were just with disabled students. So I think over that period of time, there were many different things that were happening. Because I think, once I was 8 or 9 years old, and it looks like the research kind of bears out that for disabled individuals, when you become like 8 or 9, you begin to start noticing that there's some different things that are happening, that were happening to me. Namely that until that point, my brothers were younger, right? So yes, my brother was going to school, but at 3 o'clock when the kids came home, I would go out and play with my friends. We have something called Scouts, Brownies. Yeah, you do too.
Yeah.
And so when I was 7, I started getting involved in the Brownies, and I'm Jewish, and my mother would take me to religious training classes, and I did all of that. But then when I was 8 or 9 years old, I started continuing to do that, but began to realize that I was being treated differently. And so the one value of beginning to go to classes with other disabled children was that we started to really talk at a 9-10-year-old level about how we were feeling different, because we weren't going to the same schools as our siblings, and we weren't in the same schools as our neighbors. So I think over those years and then into high school, it was this issue of, why are we being treated differently? Why are there no, what I think you call drop downs, we call curb cuts? Why can't we get across the street? New York City, and I lived in Brooklyn, had lots of buses, lots of trains, taxi cabs, all types of things like that. None of them were accessible. And the buildings were not accessible. Movie theaters, they wanted you to get out of your wheelchair. The bathrooms weren't accessible. So this was something I think that numbers of us started to really question, why is this so? And I also went to, in the summer, I would go to camp, and until I was, I guess, like a junior, maybe by the time I graduated high school, I was no longer going to these summer camps. But the summer camps were great for a lot of reasons. And I know today this is not the model that we look at, and I certainly am not a segregationist as far as disabled people, being together all the time. It should be something that we're choosing to do. But for me and many of my friends, that developmental period was a time when we did get to discuss what we wanted the world to be and how we were concerned about our futures. Because in the United States, it's very much, work hard, same as here. Go to school, do your homework, study hard, be a good kid, respect your parents and your elders, and good things will happen to you. But, many of us were pretty much doing that, but we didn't have role models around us. So I wasn't seeing like adults in jobs once in a while, but you didn't see it on television. You still don't that much today. You didn't see it in children's books. People frequently were talking in a patronizing way. And, in the newspaper, you saw disability on the charity social life page, the medical page, but not in the same way as you saw other rights. And I think, for me, what was going on in many of us in the 60s in the United States and here, there was the anti-war movement. And in the United States, there was a very strong civil rights movement. So, Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm sure a number of people know his name here. He was one of the leading African Americans fighting for equality and justice for African Americans and other minority groups. And so television was something, in the 50s and 60s was really a part of everyday life for people. And so we were able to see, on television, in the newspapers, on the radio, different activities that the civil rights community, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the Grey Panther movement, and others were embarking on. And we really didn't have much, because while there were many organizations that were working on disability, most of their work was really on cure, raise money, telethons, help the hopeless, helpless, cripples move forward. We kind of joked that try to go out and get a job the day after a telethon, that everybody was getting these tragic pictures painted about who we were, so what employer was going to want to hire us? It was just pity, pity, pity. So I think that was a very important part of my life and other friends. And when we had opportunities then to begin to come together more, and were kind of at a point in our lives where we had more authority over what we wanted to do with our lives, and started going to universities, that's when I think we also were seeing various other kinds of organizations. In the US, we saw numbers of local cross-disability organizations being funded, disabled people's organizations that basically had no money. I was involved in setting up a group in New York called Disabled in Action, which still exists today. And we were a volunteer group of disabled individuals, not all, but many of whom were in college or had graduated from college, numbers of us who were working. And that was we were formed after I had applied to be a teacher and was denied my teaching license because I couldn't walk.
I remember reading about that, yeah.
And it was a very, I kind of describe it as an alignment of the stars, because lots of people were being discriminated against in employment in the US. But at that particular period of time, it was coming towards the end of the baby boom era. So the schools were really burgeoning with students. They didn't have enough teachers. And so there was a program in New York City where you didn't have to major in education, you could minor in education. And then within 5 years, you have a master's degree. So I took all the courses I needed to take to minor in education. And when I graduated, I took the tests that I needed to take. And one was an oral exam, one was a written exam, and one was a medical exam. All of them were offered in different buildings, as I recall, and they all were inaccessible. But when I was denied my license based on failing my medical exam, I failed my medical exam because of, quote, paralysis of both lower extremities, sequelae of poliomyelitis, end quote.
Wow.
So we had no laws that made that illegal. And so people really, they wrote anything. I mean, today, nobody would write that down. I mean, that might have been the reason you didn't get hired, but you wouldn't even go to court because, okay, this is clearly discrimination. But it wasn't at that point. And I had a friend who had a disability, and he worked for the New York Times. He was a journalism major, and a guy, a reporter who was well respected in the field, wrote a piece about how the history of why I didn't get the job and how I should have gotten the job. And then the next day, the New York Times did an editorial. And then I was asked to be on a television program. And then I got 2 attorneys to represent me for free. I didn't go out seeking them. They sought me out because of the articles in the New York Times. And then there were editorials in the other major newspapers in New York at that time. And we sued, we went to court. And it's a very funny story because we had the first African-American woman judge on the federal bench. And so the Board of Ed actually settled out of court because the judge's name was Constance Baker Motley. And she basically told the Board of Ed that she strongly encouraged them to give me another medical exam. So they did, and I got my license, but then I couldn't get a job. And so there were more editorials in the papers and articles, and ultimately I got a job teaching in the same school that I had gone to school in. And I did not have a special education license. I had a regular ed license, but there were no regular classes in the basement of this school. So I taught special ed. And I taught in elementary school for 3 years. Disabled in Action was getting stronger. We were holding demonstrations in New York when President Nixon vetoed a very important piece of legislation in 1972 and 1973. And I guess that was my first foray into major civil disobedience when we shut down Madison Avenue in New York City 4:30 in the afternoon. And then we also took over Nixon headquarters in New York City 4 days before the election. Then I went to California, got involved with setting up the first Center for Independent Living. And so I've been very heavily involved in disability rights for all those years, working cross-disability, working on Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I did like 20 years of work in the nonprofit sector, disabled people's organizations, setting up a couple of them with friends. And then also I served on lots of different boards that were not necessarily disabled people's organizations. I really had the privilege of working in President Clinton's administration in the Department of Education. And then I worked at the World Bank, and I ran an agency in the District of Columbia. And then my last 6.5 years were with the Obama administration of the State Department. So my work with government and with the World Bank and obviously State Department is government really has been focusing a lot on the inclusion of disabled individuals, both the empowerment of disabled people, looking at ways of getting funding for disability rights organizations, as well as looking at getting disability integrated into major work that's being done in areas like gender, for example, but where they have including disabled girls and women, working on getting disabled girls and women included in programs that they should have been covered in, on and on. So that's kind of a long nutshell of what I've been doing.
So interesting. More recently, I've been studying more of the civil rights movements and the disability rights movement. I think, it's so important to look at kind of how things were, how we got to where we are, what the different tactics that we used, and then I guess the world does change and some of the problems can then become different, and sort of mixing up what works from the past with newer tools. Like we're having this video interview over the internet, which obviously back in the 70s wouldn't have been a tool that was available.
It didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting the kind of the similarities and the differences. I mean, when you were talking about how the different things you're involved in and how you brought about change with your peers as well, do you think the tactics are still quite similar now with the sort of coming together with disabled people, using the media, using law, lobbying government? Is that a sort of template that you think's the same, or what other differences do you think there are?
I think the template is pretty much the same, but as you were saying, we have different mediums that we can use. So social media, I think, is quite important. Disabled people having access to social media, access to the internet, access to the technology that they may need in order to be able to use social media. I think that's something that has to continue to be on our plate. I also feel that we need to be doing not just work within the disability community, although I think it's really important that we become a much stronger political movement, because I think while we look at the numbers of disabled people that our censuses show, and in England, like the United States, about 20%, and internationally, what I think is a low figure of 15%. Internationally, we're talking about 1 billion disabled people.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't see or hear the voices of 1 billion disabled people around the world. If we saw, heard the voices of 500 million disabled people, 300 million disabled people, 100 million disabled people, things would be different. And I believe we have to take it very seriously, because we're in a situation now where, Great Britain, the United States, and other countries have been developing meaningful legislation that we can argue is not always being enforced appropriately. And we can not argue, but I think we can factually say as someone said to me earlier today, the Equality Act is not as strong as the Americans with Disabilities Act. Because the Americans with Disabilities Act, in many ways, in certain areas, is not permissive. It's a requirement. So it's not use reasonable. You know, if it's reasonable to make something accessible. We do have other terms that we use, but at the end of the day, I think there are certain things that we have that are stronger than here. Mm-hmm. But I think we also need to be, on a more regular basis, really reaching out to people in the disability who we consider to have disabilities. And I think the Brits and the US have different terminology, but I use the term disabled people, and I don't use the word impairment. Lots of people, medical people use the word impairment, and I know you use it here. But for me, the word is a political word. I want people to identify as having a disability, because if they identify with having a disability, then they can also begin to feel more empowered about what it is they believe they need to be getting as a part of their daily lives. And when I talk about getting, I'm not necessarily talking about financial benefits. I mean, for me, getting on and off a bus, getting on and off a train, mm-hmm. getting in and out of a cab, being able to get a job, to be able to be promoted in a job, to be able to go to school that's accessible, to be able to have access to sign language and Braille and audio description and support if I have an intellectual disability, if I have a psychosocial disability. Those are things that I think we are not yet able to take for granted. I think the general population takes certain things for granted in our countries, right? They take for granted there's a store in the neighborhood, they can go into that store. But if the store has one step or two steps or more steps, or much of the housing stock is not accessible, and the new housing stock is not built accessibly, that not only keeps us out of it, but it also keeps us from being able to just participate in our communities. I mean, ultimately, we want to be able to contribute to our communities like everybody else. And the barriers that limit our ability to contribute, I believe, not only adversely affect us, but they adversely affect the community overall. And so I think just talking about it is not enough. I think we need to be much more demanding of our various governance structures. And I also, for me, it's becoming more and more important that those of us in some way of privilege who come from countries like ours, who are large contributors to the development agenda, we're very busy. We don't understand a lot about development. But nonetheless, I think we really need to recognize that when our governments are giving money overseas for things like road construction or school construction or hospital construction, and they don't comply with the law that they have to comply with in our countries, and they do it the old way, that it's our dollars and our pounds or euros, whatever the phrase is for the money, it's our money. And we're certainly not, as disabled people, we're not consciously, we don't want that to be what's happening. We don't want, our nation's legacies to be, we gave money like the US did in the 70s and 80s when we were doing, in the 90s, reconstruction in Vietnam, that we built all these roads and other, types of structures, and they weren't accessible. And so then people had to fight to make them accessible. As someone was telling me the other day here, Judith had built all these new schools in Pakistan and they weren't accessible. The same thing happened with USAID. So we need to exercise our voices, I think, not just locally, but internationally. And, Great Britain, like the United States, we have a lot of immigrants. And our immigrants understand the problems in their countries. which are certainly not just disability. But when you talk to people who have come to our countries where one or more of their family members have a disability, frequently what they're talking about is lack of accessibility in their countries, lack of adequate health care, etc. But significantly, stigma, discrimination, and lack of opportunities. Those things are not going to change overnight, but our development aid can, over time, be doing the right thing. So I believe it's really important that we are supporting the development of disabled people's organizations in other countries, that we're talking to our governments that provide aid, development aid in many, many different ways, and really demanding that our governments adopt and implement policies that don't replicate bad things that happen in our countries that we have fought so hard to remedy. So I think it's a big agenda. I understand that. And then again, the baseline on this is we need to be getting people like with chronic fatigue syndrome and people with other invisible disabilities, not just to be looking at issues around medical services and research, which I understand, but we also need to help people recognize that they have a disability at this point in their life, and they will be experiencing similar or identical forms of discrimination as other people who acknowledge. So to help them see that, we want them to be a part of the broader disability rights movement, because it strengthens the movement. It allows elected representatives to see that we are a political force to deal with. And at the end of the day, I'm a fervent believer in the fact that in a democracy, people running for office count votes. And if they can't count enough of us as supporting them, then we're not relevant. So it's complex, but I think social media is such an amazing bridge. We can do so many things with it that we couldn't do 20, 30 years ago because it didn't exist.
Yeah, no, I think the two really powerful things that you said that are empowering for disabled people. One is, without mentioning the word social model, we obviously both know you were talking about the social model.
I don't call it the social model. I call it the rights-based model.
The rights-based model, okay. I think in Britain it's the social model.
Because the social model it's a very academic term, right? Do women or African Americans or other minorities talk about the social model? No. They talk about it as a rights model.
Yeah,
they talk about it as equality and justice.
Yeah.
So I definitely do not call it. I talk about moving away from the medical model to the rights-based model.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what I want. I want my rights. I want equality. I don't really know. I'm not a social scientist. Neither are most Brits or Americans or anybody else. So I want my rights, and I want to call it the rights model.
Yeah. Well, I mean, semantics aside, I think the point about overcoming, yeah, I mean, I get the difference as well, but the point about overcoming the barriers is very empowering, and definitely we agree on the medical model being not the right way.
Overcoming barriers in some way also makes me feel like I have to overcome something.
No, they should be removed by society, absolutely.
Well, they should be. Tax money is being spent on buildings and roads and ramps and whatever they're doing, because they want to be inclusive of all types of disabilities that people have. But I do think that our terminology can be empowering.
Yeah.
Or it can be neutral. Or it can, the reason I don't use the word impaired, and I can have discussions with people all day long, but I've wanted to do a study. Just go down the street and don't even have a visibly disabled person going down the street, and just ask, what does the word impaired mean to you? And I guarantee you that 10 out of 10 people will not say anything positive about the word impaired.
Yeah.
Because it's not an empowering, positive word.
Yeah.
So that's why I don't use it.
Yeah. but yeah, I was afraid. So the overall point of what I found empowering in what you said was about that you're not the problem because you have a medical condition. It's the barriers of society. So yeah. And the second one was the democratic point that, you know, elected officials need our votes, and so if we can be politicized, whether that's just, you know, being involved in a petition or meeting up in local issues or going all out, you know, protesting
or running for office ourselves
and being involved in the process. Exactly. Yeah.
And running for office.
Yeah. And I know you're going to kindly share your top tips on activism in our tribe later on in the week, so we'll delve into that a bit more then. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you a little bit of time to talk about what you've been up to with Leonard Cheshire as well.
So Leonard Cheshire asked me last year if I would be interested in becoming a global ambassador. And so I know a number of the people who have been working here at Leonard Cheshire on international issues. And because I've done a fair amount of work internationally at the World Bank and the US Department of State, and way before that, because I started traveling internationally in the 70s and 80s, I said, yes, I was very interested because people are smart, they have an agenda which is similar to mine. I thought that I could help contribute to what's happening. So the global ambassador, it implies global engagement. I also have been meeting this week with Neil, who's the CEO of Leonard Cheshire, and learning more about what the organization is doing within Great Britain. And what I think is important about what's happening is really moving towards what we would call the independent living model, and looking at issues of empowerment and community integration in continually stronger way. The bulk of my work, though, what it turns out to be, we're still discussing, will be globally.
That sounds really exciting. I saw on the press release you've done a couple of talks this week as well, haven't you?
Yes, so there's a conference this week called Bridging the Gap, based on research that Leonard Cheshire has done in 5 African countries. So I spoke at that gathering, and I've also met with staff here, so I spent a good number of hours the other day meeting with staff from different program areas, learning more in depth about what they're doing domestically and internationally. And today participated in a program I think called Can Do, with some young adults. They were mainly 20, 21 who had disabilities, and met with them and did a little project. We went out and went to London, Tower Bridge, went to Tower Bridge, which was a lot of fun. It was also great to be with young people and learn from them about what they were doing and what their areas of interest are. So it's been a very good week for me.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. And how about, as we sort of wind up the interview, what's happening next? Have you got any other projects, any other travels planned?
Well, I guess one thing I also want to say is right now I'm a fellow at the Ford Foundation in New York, and I'm working on a media project, looking at how disabled individuals are faring in media broadly, both depiction on television, disabled people playing disabled characters, and disabled people playing characters, not necessarily with disabilities. And the project is really aimed at looking at how other groups, other diversity groups, are advancing and how we as disabled people compare. It's mainly focused on the US, but I think there's good work going on here in Great Britain that I believe exceeds work at this point than what's happening in the United States. So I've been meeting with a number of people who are working in the media both disabled people themselves. And yesterday I met with Channel 4 and had a very good set of discussions with them. And so for me, on a day-to-day basis, the work I'm doing with the Ford Foundation, also helping them look at including disability in their overall grant making. Being here in London has been very, very informative to me. And Leonard Cheshire has helped me set up some meetings with people so I could learn more about what's going on here. But I have to say, I'm pretty impressed with work that is happening here in the media. Again, like everything in disability, it is certainly not to say that, you know, Britain is where it needs to be or the US is where it needs to be, because we're not. But I think there's been more in-depth thinking, at least on the part of corporate leadership, in some areas in ways that I haven't yet seen in the States.
That's interesting to hear about. I mean, I think with the media world, it sort of connects to what we were saying earlier about journalism and getting a story out there, but takes it that step further, that when disabled people are portrayed more in everyday life on people's screens and on the radio and everywhere else, it kind of helps the mass population to understand the battles we're trying to fight, and then that may even bring more votes and democratic power beyond the disabled community as well. So it's a long game, but it's good to see all the progress.
And I think it's also very important that there are slow changes that are happening, not continuing to look at the issue of cure. Or if you're not cured, committing suicide. It's kind of like the extremes, right?
Yeah.
You're a failure because you're not cured and you kill yourself. And so I think really the more disabled individuals are involved in the various aspects of media, who also see having a disability as not being a negative, but something which is a part of normal life, and that we need to be fighting in many different levels to be addressing these issues. And I think media plays a very important role, just like I think the religious community, for those people who are religious and participate in religious life, the leaders of the religious communities, if they have messages which are, you know, negative, which are, you know, talking about taking care of, you know, the poor, whatever, those are all the wrong messages. But, and business leaders, when business leaders not only speak about disability, but can demonstrate that they've been hiring disabled people, and that if they have a hidden disability themselves, like a learning disability or depression or whatever it may be, that they also speak out about it, because that makes people have a better understanding of who we are broadly and what it is we're able to do. And like everybody else, everything in our lives doesn't work perfectly. But as a community of people, disabled and non-disabled, I think the ability to be more out and public and working as a community on reforms is very important.
Yeah, it kind of feels like we're trying to change the narrative of what disability is from that old school pity, sympathy, all the rest of it, to empowerment, untapped potential, and that the world's better off for everyone being included.
Yep.
All right, well, there's a million other questions I could ask you, Judy, but I better let you get off. Thank you so much for your time today, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon, yeah?
Thank you.
Great. And everyone watching, tune in later in the week where you can see Judy's top tips in the Facebook group of the D Horizons tribe. Thank you. And goodbye.
Could you also look at the Heumann perspective, HEUMANN, the Heumann perspective, on Facebook or YouTube?
Brilliant. Good. Yeah, definitely check that out as well, guys. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.